Hello again, my name is Philip Matthew, and I'm the Education Coordinator with the Cape Elizabeth Land Trust. This is the first video in a series that we're doing for use by schools, and specifically for the fourth graders at Pond Cove Elementary School. Now, if you're not at Pond Cove Elementary School, maybe you're not even a student, that's okay. We're trying to make these videos something that'll be interesting and worth watching for pretty much anyone. This video is all about observation, and specifically seasonal observation. We're going to start out by talking a little bit about what observation means and why it's an important skill for a scientist. Then we'll discuss what a sit spot is and why picking a location to use for your observations can be really helpful when observing nature. And last, we'll discuss what seasonal observations you can make this time of year here in southern Maine. So first off, what is observation? Merriam-Webster defines observation as an act, something you do, of recognizing and noting, so, observing things happening, a fact or occurrence often involving measurement. So altogether, an act of recognizing and noting a fact or occurrence often involving measurement. Now, as scientists, we have to do a lot of observation because it's how we collect data. Whether you're taking a measurement of how tall a plant has grown or, doing some chemistry experiment, all of those measurements are observations. In general, when you're observing, there are some things you can keep in mind. One is that it's really important to actually write down what you observe. And so for that, I have a journal with me. If you're a fourth grader, you probably have one of these as well. If you're someone else, it's great if you have just a piece of paper or anything else that you can write on. You could even use a phone for notes, or if writing isn't your thing, you could record a voice memo. Anything like that works. So there's a couple key parts of an observation that I always try to include. First things first, I like to make a note of the date. So I'll write the date. I like to put it in the upper right-hand corner. You can put it wherever you want. And then I also like to write down the place, and I like to write down the time that I am recording the observation. Sometimes the time doesn't matter, but if it's something like, the temperature, it might matter whether you took the temperature in the middle of a sunny day or in the middle of a cold night. When I'm making observations, it's always important to try to use as many of your senses as you can, especially if you don't have scientific tools with you to make measurements with. So I'm going to just, as an example, do some observation of this bull thistle plant. And I'm going to try to show you what I could use my different senses to tell about this plant. So first off, in terms of my sense of touch, if I'm gentle, I can feel that it's actually got these different size spikes all along the stem. And right now they're still pretty pointy, but they're brittle. If I sort of bend them and break them, they'll come off the plant rather than going into my finger. There's also sort of a fluffy area, and I also notice with my sense of sight that the fluffy part along where the flowers were is white. Earlier in the year when I was here, those flowers were bright purple. So that's a cool example of how the color has actually changed as the season has progressed and as the seasonal cycle of this bull thistle plant has progressed. If I use my sense of smell right now, I can't really smell that much, partially because it's cold outside and also because this plant is starting to go into dormancy. So those flowers might have had a cool smell earlier this year, but not so much at the moment. If I use my sense of hearing, you might think it's kind of weird to try to hear a plant. But if I actually get close, I can hear the faint rustle of the different stalks and stems against each other. And even though that might not mean that much, it's not like I can tell from that rustle what type of plant it is. It does tell me that this plant is pretty dry right now. And that gives me a hint that, yeah, it's probably getting into fall. It's probably drying up to go into dormancy for the winter. The last of my senses is, of course, my sense of taste. I'm not going to use that right now, but if you had something that you knew was edible, you could try that out. It's just important, especially when you're out in nature, to make sure you know what it is first before you taste something. So that's an example of how I can use my 5 senses to make some observations about this bull thistle plant. And now what I'm going to do is write some of those down in my journal. Now that we've practiced making some observations, I'm going to introduce the idea of a sit spot. A sit spot is exactly what it sounds like. It's a spot that you sit when you're observing nature. But it's really helpful to have an individual location where you can do that. The reason for that is, you can go outside anytime, any place, and observe things in general. But if you really want to observe like a scientist, it's helpful to repeat your observations. And an easy way to repeat an observation is to just make the observation in the same place. So I've decided that this is going to be my sit spot near my house. And there were sort of 3 reasons that I like the spot. The first one is that it's easy to access. You can't see it, but I'm right out behind my house in a spot that I can get to even if the weather is a little bit gross, even when it's snowy. This is a spot that's easy to get to for me. You could pick a spot in your backyard or your front yard. You could even pick a spot out on a trail near your house, but you don't want something too far away because that will make it hard to go there and do your observations. So pick a spot that's convenient for you. The second thing about this spot is it's interesting. There's some cool plants to observe. We've got this really interesting bull thistle plant, but I can also see a forest over in that direction. I've got some farm fields out behind me with a little marsh running down the back. There's a couple different things to look at. You might not have all of those different ecosystems in your sit spot, but as long as you've got something that's interesting to look at in nature, that'll do. So convenient location, interesting nature to keep an eye on, to make observations of. And lastly, you want to pick something that's relatively easy to find. So don't just go out into the middle of the woods and pick a random spot that you might not be able to get back to. For me, I'm next to this big granite well cap, which is really easy to find in my backyard. But for you, it could be one tree that you really like to sit under, or it could be a big rock that's in the woods next to your house. Or it could even just be one corner of your house. Maybe you have a smaller yard and it's just trees right behind your house, and you can just pick a corner of your house to sit near and observe nature. So with a sit spot that's convenient, has some interesting things to observe, and is easy to find, I'm set to make observations throughout the coming year. And that's really important, especially if you're observing things like seasonal changes or things that change from season to season. If we want to observe those things, we're going to have to be able to return to the same spot to get them at different parts in their seasonal cycle. So the last thing we're going to talk about in this video is seasonal observation. That means just observing things related to the changes of the seasons. There's actually a really cool scientific word for this type of study. It's called phenology. And it basically means studying not just the cycle of the seasons themselves, but the way that cycles of organisms like this bull thistle plant or the trees or different animals, how those cycles relate to the seasonal cycles. So I'm going to give just a couple quick examples of observations related to phenology that we can make right here from my sit spot. The first is just looking at the ground at my feet. I've got all kinds of dry leaves, but they're not entirely brown and colorless. There's still a hint of redness to some of the oak leaves. There's some maples interspersed as well that still have some color to them. This is a great example of a seasonal observation. Every year, the leaves change colors and fall from the deciduous trees in our area. So it's part of the life cycle of the tree, but it's also part of the cycle of the seasons. And that's exactly what phenology is all about. So that's a really easy example, but looking around, I can see other hints at and other observations that would indicate that the seasons are changing. This bull thistle, it's not a deciduous tree, it's not dropping its leaves per se, but it's clearly going into a dormant phase, and it's starting to release its seeds that it grew over the course of the summer into the fall. It's trying to get those seeds dispersed so that they can grow in other places next year. If I make observations just about the temperature right now, it's a lot colder here than it was this summer. And so I can say as the temperature gets colder, that might be an indication that the season is starting to change into fall. So those are just a couple quick examples of observations you can make that tell you something about the changes of the cycles of the organisms and the cycles of the seasons. But now I challenge you to go out and see what observations you can make about the changes of the seasons and the cycles of organisms in your backyard or wherever you might pick to do your observation. So that's going to do it for this video, but we'll be back with more videos as the season progresses and as the school year goes on.